In just a moment, we'll be hearing from Doug McKenzie-Mohr, all the way from Canada, joining us for this 90-minute introduction to community-based social marketing. Now, I met Doug about 5 or 10 years ago at one of the workshops that he ran in Brisbane. I then went out and actually bought his book called Fostering Sustainable Behaviour and enjoyed reading more about it. So folks, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Doug to our webinar today. So I'll just change the presenting mode here so that Doug can share his screen with us. So Doug, thanks for staying up late at night there and getting ready to present for us. We're just waiting for your screen to come up now, and we can see that, and if it can just make it fill the screen. That's beautiful. That's coming across really well. So Doug, over to you.
Great. Thanks, John. Good evening, everyone from Canada. I'd like to start off by just mentioning that this is, as John mentioned, a 90-minute introduction to community-based social marketing. For those of you who would like to learn more, I will be doing a whole series of workshops in February and March of 2014 in both Australia as well as in New Zealand. I wasn't expecting people on the line from New Zealand this morning, but thank you very much for joining us. And you can see up on the screen the different locations in which those workshops are going to be located. You can see also the address for the website for those sessions. We're also providing a special reduction in cost for people who are on this session and would like to be able to register for the session, so you can see that coupon code there as well. I'll put this up at the very end as well, but I wanted to just let you know that this is basically a brief introduction to material that's covered in the workshops I'll be delivering in February and March. So I wanted to start off the session this morning by telling you a story that'll set the stage for everything that I'll discuss with you. I grew up in Winnipeg, and for those of you who are less familiar with the geography of Canada, Winnipeg is on the prairies, and it's one of the coldest places that you can possibly imagine. It's very common for us to have temperatures of -30 to -40 degrees Celsius during the middle of the wintertime. I fortunately left Winnipeg after doing an undergraduate degree in psychology and moved to Southern Ontario, just about an hour south of Toronto, to do my graduate work, and then I taught for 5 years in Southern Ontario as well. And the story that I want to tell you has to do with something that happened to our family when we moved from Southern Ontario out to New Brunswick, where you live now. If you take a look at a map of North America, you'll see that Southern Ontario is at literally about the same latitude as Northern California, and it's markedly warmer than what I experienced growing up in Winnipeg. And in 1993, when my wife and I and our 2 very young daughters at that time moved from Southern Ontario out to New Brunswick. New Brunswick is directly north of Boston by about 7 hours by car and about an hour inland. When we moved there in 1993, I didn't give a lot of thought to how the winters in New Brunswick might be different than the winters I got very used to in Southern Ontario. Southern Ontario, as I mentioned, is very mild compared to what I was very used to in Winnipeg. So we moved out in 1993, and after we got our house set up, one of the very first things I did is I went out and bought a new composter. For obvious reasons, when people move their homes, they do not move their composters. So I went and bought this new composter, and I put it together, and then I went in the house and I said to my wife, "Where do you think we should put this in the backyard?" And soon I were having this conversation in the kitchen at the back of our house looking out our backyard. And my wife says to me, "Why don't you put it back there?" Now the back there that she's pointing at is this bush that's just strategically larger than the size of a composter. So if you put the composter back behind the bush, you're not going to see it looking out any of the back windows of our home. And in the summer of 1993, that seemed like a good idea. So we began to compost, and we composted through July, August, September, October, November, December, and then it began to snow. And it began to snow like nothing I've ever seen in my life before. Now for the last 10 years or thereabouts, I've been strategically leaving Canada in the middle of our winter and coming to Australia and New Zealand, as I am this next coming winter for us. And 3 years ago, when I was in New Zealand and Australia and I was speaking to her, my wife sent me an email. And in this email, there was no content saying I miss you, etc. There was simply a picture attached. And I'm about to show you a picture of our front yard. And what my wife literally said is in the subject line, she said, "It's time to come home!" exclamation mark. And you're about to see a picture of our front yard. Now, to get a sense of just how high that snow is that you're looking at, my wife sent me a second picture. And the second picture you're about to see is a picture of the stop sign at the corner of our lot. We've got a corner lot, so there's a stop sign at the corner of our lot. And here's a picture of the stop sign. Now, before this call, I actually checked on Google to see how high stop signs are in Canada. And by regulation, they're 2.16 meters to the bottom of the sign, and the sign itself is 60 centimeters. So you're looking here at roughly 2.5 meters of snow. When my wife sent me the second picture, by the way, she said in the subject line, "Time to come home now, comma, I really mean it," 3 exclamation marks this time. And if you think about this amount of snow, and you think about composting that first winter, I would come home from work, and I'd shovel off our driveway, and I'd shovel the pathway to the front door and to the side door, and then I'd go behind the house, and I'd shovel this pathway out to the backyard composter that I stupidly put at the back of a long, narrow backyard. And I was doing this 2 to 3 times a week. By late December, it's dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was cold out. It snowed yet again. And then I came home and shoveled off the driveway and shoveled off the front walkway and the side walkway. I went into the backyard to shovel that pathway to the backyard composter again. It was completely snowed in again. And rather than shoveling it out, I went into the house and said to my wife, "That's it. For the remainder of this first winter, those organics are ended up at the curbside rather than backyard composter." So why am I starting off this webinar by telling you a story? Like everyone else on this call, I'm relatively knowledgeable about sustainability issues. But for the first winter, my behavior was not consistent with either my attitudes or my knowledge of the expected importance of sustainability generally or waste reduction in particular. And if you and I are all honest with one another, that's true of all of us. We're the very people who are designing and delivering programs to try to foster changes in people's behavior. But the reality is, none of us always consistently takes the shortest showers we possibly can, reduces the amount of waste as much as we possibly can, takes transportation or makes transportation choices that get us to wherever we wish to be going in a way that significantly reduces CO2 every single time. The very people who are designing and delivering the programs that are the backbone of sustainability, we ourselves don't consistently engage in the behaviors that will move us forward. And the reason why I'm starting off by stressing that is if that's true of you and I, it's certainly going to be true in spades of everyone that we're delivering and designing programs for. So in the brief time that I have with you this morning, I want to talk with you about how we can design programs more effectively. But I want to begin off by talking about the way that we traditionally think about designing and delivering programs. Because a lot of what we're doing presently in terms of designing and delivering programs to foster behavioral changes that support sustainability, unfortunately, are not likely to work well for us. And so I want to go over the kinds of traditional approaches that are used in Canada, Australia, and elsewhere, and then I want to contrast that with what, as John said, is called community-based social marketing. So let's take a look at what we traditionally do. I'm an environmental psychologist by training, and we refer to the vast majority of programs that are out there today as being information intensive. What that means is we make use of radio, television, the internet, and newsprint to push information to people with the hope that providing them with that information is going to change their behavior. Now, these information-intensive programs tend to be based upon one of 2 models of behavioral change. The first is something, as you can see on the screen, it's called the attitude behavior change approach, and the second is something called the economic self-interest. And my guesstimate is that probably more than 75% of all the programs in Australia, like in Canada, that are designed to foster behavioral change related to sustainability are based upon one of these 2 models. And why that's important to point out is neither of these approaches, as I alluded to a moment ago, work very well in actually changing people's behavior. So let's take a look, first of all, at the attitude behavior change approach. The attitude behavior change approach suggests that if you want to bring about changes in people's behavior, we start first and foremost by trying to change people's attitudes and alter their level of knowledge with the hope that by changing their attitudes with respect to some environmental issue and by altering their knowledge with respect to some environmental issue, they will then subsequently change their behavior. And as you can see on the screen, it's a very simple prediction. The suggestion is that if we change attitudes and we change knowledge, that will result in changes in environmental behavior. Well, that prediction, interestingly, is testable. We can look to see what is the actual correlation or relationship between people's environmental attitudes, their knowledge, and their actual behavior. And what's intriguing about this is that often we find no connection, and when we often do find a connection between these things, it's often very, very weak. Now, this isn't to say that we don't want to try to change people's environmental attitudes or change their knowledge. But if that's all we do, the likelihood that we're going to see substantial changes in people's behavior is remote. And let me show you 2 examples of this. This first example is Great example to begin with because it goes so far beyond what most of us could hope to do in designing a living room program. This is a 3-hour energy efficiency workshop. So I want you to imagine for whatever groups you're designing living room programs for, that you have 3 hours with your target audience. Most of us don't get 30 seconds, let alone 3 hours. But in this particular project, they have 3 hours. In addition to having 3 hours to educate people about how they can make their homes more energy efficient, in addition to those 3 hours, they were working with highly motivated people. How do we know that? Because they literally ran an ad in the local newspaper saying, if you want to come to this workshop, we have only 40 spaces. You have to call in immediately because as soon as those 40 spaces are full, it'll be closed off. So people called in quickly to be able to register themselves for this recession. So they're taking basically 3 hours on Saturday morning to learn more about how they can make their homes more energy efficient. Now, the man who set up this actual project is a man named Scott Geller, a colleague of mine, and he wanted to test whether or not the attitude behavior change approach actually works. So what he did, interestingly, is he measured people's attitudes with respect to energy efficiency and their knowledge before the workshop began, and then Scott did the same thing afterwards. And what he was able to demonstrate by testing their knowledge and the attitudes before and afterwards is that people were substantially more knowledgeable of the actions that they could engage in to make their homes more energy efficient, and they had attitudes that were much more supportive of engaging in specific actions. So from an attitude behavior change perspective, this workshop had done exactly what you would hope it would do. It had changed attitudes and it changed knowledge. So if it's changed those things, what we should expect then is that people's behavior would change as well. So months later, Geller actually goes to the people's homes to find out what, if anything, have they actually done. And remember, we've got 40 participants in the workshop. One of them had lowered the temperature on their hot water heater, something had been recommended in the workshop. 2 people had installed insulating blankets around their hot water heater, but those 2 people had done that before the workshop actually began. The only other thing that people did is 8 of 40 people after the workshop installed high-efficiency shower heads. Now that sounds more encouraging. Nearly 25% have installed these high-efficiency shower heads. It sounds more encouraging until you learn that all 40 of them were given high-efficiency shower heads at the workshop, and only 8 of them put them in place. And what this case study really demonstrates, along with many others in the first chapter of my book, is that if all we do is alter people's attitudes and raise their level of knowledge, while we may see some changes in behavior as they did here, those changes are often very modest compared to what we can receive if we're delivering more effective programs. So that's one approach. The second, or one case study, here's the second case study I want to go over with you. This is a case in which they spent $50,000 Australian producing a water use handbook. This handbook described wasteful water use. It talked about the relationship between water and energy, because a lot of people don't realize that when they turn their tap on, there's a significant amount of energy that actually goes into getting that water to people's homes or businesses and then dealing with it as wastewater afterwards. And the handbook also detailed conservation methods that people could engage in. Now, what's intriguing about this particular case study is that every household in this community was individually water metered, and only half of the households received the handbook and half did not. And they randomly signed. And random assignment literally means that by chance, half the people are going to receive the handbook, and by chance the other half may not. You might literally be living beside someone who receives the handbook, and the person and you yourself don't get it. When we use random assignment in that way, it makes our groups equivalent to one another. So any subsequent differences we would see in the water usage would be due to the handbook being delivered to half of them and not to the other half. So what do they see in terms of differences in water usage? Absolutely none. And we see this finding again and again and again in the literature. The principal thing that people do is they produce brochures and flyers and bill stuffers, and they send that information out to people with the hope that providing them with that information is going to change people's behavior. And we've got a very compelling literature now that suggests that if that's all we do, the likelihood that we'll actually see changes in people's behavior is remote. Now, the second approach is something called economic self-interest. This is an approach that's used extensively in Australia by gas, water, and electric utilities. These utilities presume that people are systematic and they will act in their economic self-interest. And then all we have to do is point out to someone that some action, like installing a high-efficiency shower head, putting in a programmable thermostat in your house, closing the blinds, etc. That those actions, once people understand that they're in their financial best interest, that enlightenment will equal changes in behavior. This is an approach, again, that's used extensively by utilities. It's sometimes called a rational economic model. Otherwise, it's called an economic self-interest model. Now, I'm going to introduce you to the largest case study I know in the world of people making use of this model. It's a program, interestingly, called the Residential Conservation Service. And it was brought into being by an act of Congress in the United States. Now, I know it's hard today to imagine the United States Congress doing anything, but at this time, they passed this really sweeping law that mandated that every gas and electric utility in the United States had to do three things. They've got absolutely no choice on this. So what did they have to do? First of all, they had to provide free energy audits to any household in the United States that wanted one. At the time that they delivered these audits, those audits cost about $300 US per household to deliver. In today's dollars, it's closer to about $750. It's estimated the total amount of money that was spent collectively by utilities across the United States delivering this program was in the billions of dollars. Interestingly, no one thought to do an actual pilot before they delivered this program across the whole United States. So every household in the U.S. can get a free energy audit. Every household in the United States has access to interest-free or low-cost loans that the gas and electric utilities themselves underwrite. And every household in the United States has access to contractors who have been pre-approved or certified by these gas and electric utilities. Now, someone did a meta-analysis, and before I show you the results of the meta-analysis, which means it's averaging of all the published research across the United States, I want to just ask you to think about an interesting question. If we're going to deliver an audit, the really important question that we need to be asking ourselves is, if we're providing an audit to someone's home, and it costs us, in today's dollars, $750 roughly to deliver the audit, we ought to be getting more than $750 in return in energy efficiency investments for delivering that audit. If we're not getting that, we'd be far better served by just going into the people's homes and retrofitting them for free for that money. And I just want to be clear that whenever we deliver something like an audit, we have to be presuming that we will get more out of this than when it actually costs us to deliver the audit. So an important question becomes then, if you're spending $750 per household delivering an audit, what could we actually accomplish if we took that money and went into someone's home and just retrofitted it for free? Now, I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know the answer to the question, what would happen if we spent just a third of that? There's a community north of Toronto called Sudbury. It's a fairly small community, about 150,000 people, in which they went into people's homes, low-income households, and they said, we don't want to do an audit for your household. What we want to do instead is just install some energy-efficient devices. We'd like to put a programmable thermostat in. We'd like to check your hot water heater thermostat. If it's set too high, we'll lower it down to where it should be. We want to install a high-efficiency shower head. We want to put a blanket around your hot water heater. And we can do all of those things for you for free for about $250. Now, surprisingly, virtually everyone said, sure, I'd be happy to have you come in. So they have nearly 100% participation rate. And the average energy savings that they received per household were 15 to 20%. So whatever they receive with the Residential Conservation Service has to be a lot better than 15 to 20% if you can get 15 to 20% spending just a third of the amount of money. So what did they actually accomplish? So when they did this meta-analysis of the Residential Conservation Service program, again, the reason why I'm introducing you to all of this is it's all based upon economic self-interest. They're telling people when they do these audits, here are things that you can do and it will save you money. When they evaluated this program, they found that only 6% of the U.S. public actually requested audits. And just because someone requests an audit doesn't mean they're actually going to do anything. So what percentage of those homes actually acted? The answer to that is just half the homes. And the average energy savings, as you can see on the screen, was just 2 to 3%. But unfortunately, we can't even attribute that 2 to 3% is being due to the audit. And the reason why we can't attribute that is that anyone who requests an audit is probably more motivated than the general public. These people might have actually acted anyway, independent of the audit actually being delivered to them. Now, we can actually tease out how much of that 2 to 3% is actually due to the audit by looking at what's called a waiting list control. If you guys think back to the picture that I showed you of the front of our house with all the snow in front of it, it looks like we've got a pretty new house. Our house is actually about 70 years old, but about 6 years ago, my wife and I had our home extensively retrofitted to make it much more energy efficient and to reduce its carbon footprint. I called up our local utility and asked them to send an auditor around our household to let us know the things that we could do to make our home more energy efficient. It took them 10 months to send someone around to our household. We were in what's called a waiting list control. We're waiting to have this actual audit be delivered by the person. By the time the auditor actually got to our household, we had actually made all the retrofits. So in the Residential Conservation Service program, when they included waiting list controls, here's what they found. 30% of the people on the waiting list engaged in exactly the same behavioral changes as the people who went through the audit, which means that the United States spent several $billions delivering a program based upon economic self-interest, in which only 6% of households requested audits. Only half of those people actually acted, and the actual energy savings that we can attribute to those 3% of households that acted is less than 1% reduction in energy use. And there's no way that we can describe this being anything other than an abject failure. So 2 models I've gone over with you, attitude behavior change approach and economic self-interest, they again underscore the vast majority of programs delivered in Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. And so before I pause in a moment and to take questions, I want to just go over with you why I think these programs are prevalent, despite the fact that they tend not to work very well. I think the first reason is I think we just systematically underestimate the difficulty of changing behavior. And I think that one of the reasons why we do that is we look at the fact that advertisements are used very effectively for commercial companies, Nike, for example, to get people to purchase their products. But I think what happens is we literally get seduced into thinking that the same approaches that can be used for the purchase of commercial products can work to foster behavioral changes related to sustainability. And if you think about that for a moment, the task that we're interested in is just substantially more difficult. If you're Ford, for example, what you want someone to do is to purchase your car at the time that they're thinking about purchasing a new vehicle. In contrast, many of us who are on the line or working on transportation programs, we're interested in not having the person purchase the car at all. What we want the person to do is to be thinking about carpooling, telecommuting, trip chaining, a whole series of behavioral changes that are far more difficult to bring about than simple alteration in what's called a consumer purchase preference. So I think one thing is that we just underestimate the difficulty changing behavior. And in part we do that because we tend to go to communication firms to get assistance with their programs. And these are the people who spend most of their time and make most of the profits from designing commercial advertising campaigns. And not surprisingly, they come back to us and say, let's deliver an information-intensive campaign to bring about these kinds of behavioral changes. We're literally, unfortunately, going to the wrong people and getting the wrong kind of advice. The second reason why I think these kinds of programs may be prevalent is expediency. If you're interested not so much in changing behavior, but instead you're a state or federal agency and you want the public to be perceiving that you're doing something, well, broad-based advertising is a way to be able to go about showcasing the programs you're delivering. It may not be changing behavior, but it is an effective way to get lots of people to believe that you're actually doing something. Third reason, many of the people who design and deliver these programs do not have a background in the social sciences, and understandably, they fall back upon their own implicit theories as to why people would change their behavior. Those theories tend to be the attitude behavior change approach and economic self-interest. Fourth reason, it's relatively easy to deliver these kinds of programs compared to what I'll be introducing you to in a moment. And finally, many of our programs are not evaluated. And if we do evaluate them, we tend to evaluate them based upon what I would call outputs rather than outcomes. And those outputs mean that we're counting the number of brochures that are distributed, the amount of exposure that people had to newsprint pieces that we might have run, radio ads, television ads, etc. Those are the kinds of conventional metrics that are used by the advertising agencies, and they're very poor surrogates to actually measuring changes in behavior. What we should be measuring are outcomes rather than outputs. And the three outcomes that are of interest to people working on sustainability issues are, first and foremost, are we measuring changes in behavior? And what you might want to write down about this is that when we measure changes in behavior, traditionally, we've done that by asking people to self-report. We need to be really careful about getting self-reports. And the reason for that is that people tend to, first of all, exaggerate their self-reports. And secondly, whenever we use self-reports as a way of evaluating our programs are working or not, people know that we're actually observing them. And when people know that we're observing them, there's a good likelihood that they will change their behavior just based upon that knowledge. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, if they change their behavior, that's what I really care about. The reason why we have to be concerned about this is we're tending to do those evaluations, understandably, when we're running pilots. And if part of the reason why our pilots are working is that people know that we're observing them, when we move from the pilot to broad-scale invitation, our programs may fail because the observation is no longer built in to broad-scale invitation. So when we think about measuring outcomes, we want to measure changes in behavior, and we like to do that in a way that's unobtrusive, whenever possible, does not rely upon self-reports. The second thing we want to be thinking about measuring is changes in resource use. Are people using less water? Are they using less natural gas? The third thing is we want to look at changes in resource quality. Our catchments, is the nutrient loads in catchments different? Are we seeing airshed quality in Melbourne, right, for example, improve? So 3 things we want to measure: changes in behavior, changes in resource use, and changes in resource quality. And those are all outcomes rather than outputs. So John, let me pause here. Next slide, I'm going to move into talking about community-based social marketing. But let me pause here and have you ask people if they have questions at this point that I might delve into them further with.
Great, thanks Doug. And you've set the scene really well for us, and you've helped to highlight why there is a problem. So folks, this is the time where you can type your questions at the bottom of the floating control panel there, and if it's hidden itself, you just click on that little orange arrow again, and you should be able to see your question pane at the bottom. Well, there are no questions there at the moment, so I've got a question for the audience. Folks, if you can relate to what Doug's talking about and the difficulty of getting a message across to a wider audience, can you raise your electronic hand, please? So if you've struggled, and particularly with for those who work in government agencies, you know, the easy reliance on the printed media, as Doug was talking about before, and that it's just a quick fix, and it's easy to tick the box for those outputs as opposed to the outcomes. Great, so I can see, yeah, heaps of hands up, so yeah, about 2/3 of the audience have responded there, Doug. So they're certainly feeling your pain. So Doug, let's move on and hear some of the things we can do about that. Thanks.
Okay. So let me introduce you then to an alternative. This is an alternative that I call community-based social marketing, or that many people refer to as CBSM. As I mentioned at the outset, I'm trained as an environmental psychologist, and when I first graduated and began teaching, I was really interested in looking at how the knowledge coming out of the field of psychology could be supplemented with knowledge coming out of the field of social marketing. And community-based social marketing is really an attempt to merge together 2 different disciplines and apply that knowledge base specifically to sustainability-related behavioral changes. Community-based social marketing is now being applied broadly throughout the world. There are literally tens of thousands of different programs where people are using these approaches, and some of them are really quite massive in scope. In Queensland, for example, I served as an advisor on the Climate Smart services, on the Water White services that were delivered over 500,000 households across the state, principally based upon community-based social marketing. A water corporation based out of Perth, as many of you know, is delivering large-scale programs to hundreds of thousands of households that are based upon using community-based social marketing. Many of the bicycle network approaches that are being used out of Melbourne are also based upon this approach. And we're just now in the last year beginning to see these approaches being applied to natural resource management issues as well. So broad-based approaches being used both in New Zealand as well as in Australia. So what is community-based social marketing? Community-based social marketing is based upon 5 steps. The first of these is very, very careful selection of which behaviors we might go after. Whether you're working in the area of reducing water usage, trying to reduce waste, trying to enhance energy efficiency, changing people's transportation behaviors, trying to get people to engage in conservation-related actions, protecting catchments, etc. Whatever area of sustainability you might be working in, we almost always have a really wide cross-section of behaviors that we might actually try to facilitate. If you think about residential energy efficiency, for example, it turns out from the work that we did in Queensland, there are over 240 specific requests that we could make of people to make their homes more energy efficient. And we can all agree between ourselves that all of those behaviors cannot be equally important. Some of them have to be much more important than others. And so the question we're asking ourselves is, of that long list of behaviors, which of those are most important? And that's the first step of community-based social marketing. We're trying to take a long list of potential candidate behaviors, and we're trying to cull that down to a shorter list. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. Now, the second step, once we have that shorter list of behaviors, is to uncover what the barriers and benefits are to the behaviors we select in the first step. And you might want to jot this down. This is perhaps one of the most important things we'll cover in the session this morning. We're quite confident now, environmental psychologists are quite confident, that the barriers to each of the behavioral changes that we want to foster are distinct. We see that with waste reduction actions, barriers to people participating in curbside recycling are different from them remembering to bring cotton shopping bags with them when they're shopping. They're different from getting people to participate in backyard composting. We see different patterns of barriers across different energy efficiency actions. Same thing happens with transportation. Same thing happens with different conservation behaviors that we might like people to be engaged in. In whatever domain you might be working in, the barriers to behavioral changes that you want to foster are often going to be different. And so the second step is to uncover what those barriers are, because we obviously can't develop effective strategies unless we know what's precluding people from engaging in actions we want to foster. The second part of this is we want to understand what people perceive to be beneficial about the particular behavior that we're trying to encourage. And I want to underscore this point as well. We often deliver programs from the perspective of the reason why we want people to engage in behavioral change. So I've worked on many different programs where people's principal reason for delivering a program is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. But often when you do barrier and benefit research, you find out that reducing CO2 is not a principal reason why people change their transportation habits or make their homes more energy efficient. They have lots of other reasons for why they may want to engage in those actions. And at the level of the second step, what we're trying to uncover is what are those motivations. They may not be the same reason why we're delivering the program, but we need to find out what those things are, because if we understand those, we can often deliver the programs through that lens and make it more likely that people will change their behavior. So the second step is to uncover these barriers and benefits, and again, I'll give you a brief introduction later as to how we go about doing that. Third step is to develop strategies specifically to target the barriers and benefits we've identified in the second step. Fourth is to pilot the strategies, because we want to make sure that our programs are working effectively and changing behavior and that they're cost effective before we finally go on to the fifth step, which is broad-scale implementation. If you look at what you see on the screen, none of what I've presented to you is rocket science. We need to carefully select the behaviors to make sure that we're working with the most effective behaviors. Secondly, we need to uncover the barriers and benefits because they tend to be unique. We need to develop strategies that address those barriers and benefits. We need to pilot test them, and then we need to go on to broad-scale implementation. Now, while this is a fairly linear process, as you can see, there are two feedback loops built inherently into it. Here's the first one. Once you've identified the barriers and benefits, you literally have to have an avuncular chat with yourself in which you say, can I effectively address these barriers and benefits? And if not, you're not going to be able to bring about the behavioral change. So you want to slide back to the first step and select another behavior to focus on. The second feedback loop is here. You pilot test the strategy, it doesn't work effectively. What's common then to do, obviously, is to revise the strategy, redeliver it, but if it's still not working effectively, we're going to slide back to the first step and select another behavior. Now, what you might want to jot down is you need to use this process for each behavior you're going to focus on. That doesn't mean that you're going to deliver one program at a time. There's an emerging literature that suggests that we might focus on as many as 5 or 6 behaviors at a time. But for each of those behaviors, we have to have a strategy that effectively addresses their barriers and benefits. Why no more than 5 or 6? There's emerging literature around what's called decision fatigue. Suggests that if we go after more than 5 or 6 behaviors at a time, the likelihood that people will do anything, interestingly, drops dramatically. So you probably want to catch yourself in no more than 5 or 6 behaviors, but for each of those behaviors, we have to have specific strategies that do a good job of addressing their barriers and benefits. So let's start off by talking a little bit about selecting behaviors. And as I finish this section, I'll answer questions again, John. So around selecting behaviors, the first thing I want to suggest that we do is we step back and ask ourselves, are we working in the right sector in order to be maximally effective? So I'm going to show you some Canadian data and walk you through how you can use this type of information in order to be able to make careful selections about which behaviors we should focus on. And I'm purposely using an energy efficiency example this morning, and the reason why I'm doing that is that all of us obviously have some familiarity with energy use in our personal homes. So this is data from Canada. If we look from data that was brought forward by Natural Resources Canada, they're collapsing all forms of energy use together for the whole country. Industrial energy use, it turns out to be about 39% of all energy use in Canada. Transportation is about 30%. Residential comes in at 16%. Commercial and institutional, which sometimes is called the ICI sector, comes in at 13%. And agricultural energy use in Canada is just 3%. Now, the reason why it's useful, whether you're working in water, energy, waste, transport, energy, etc., to start off with these kinds of pie charts, is they help us to be able to identify, are we working in this sector in which we can maximize the types of results that we see. So if you look at agriculture, for example, just 3% of energy use in Canada is agriculture-based. You might be delivering a program in the agricultural sector, and no matter how good it is, it's not going to matter because it's such a small overall slice of the pie. So what we want to do is we want to look at these initial pie charts and make sure that we're working in areas that allow us to be maximally effective. And then we pull out one of these slices of the pie chart, and then we begin to dissect it. So I'm going to choose residential, even though it's not the largest slice here at 16% of the overall energy use, because it's something that all of us have familiarity with. So once you've selected a particular sector, then you want to ask yourself, how is waste, water, energy, transport, etc. being influenced by this particular sector? So in this case, we're looking at energy. And here's energy use in Canada. 59% of all energy use in Canadian homes is for space heating. Now, these numbers would be dramatically different, obviously, in Australia because you have a much warmer climate. But what I want you to note here is that we've just taken this list of 240 behaviors, and we've culled it down to a much, much shorter list. We know that the most important behaviors in Canada related to residential energy efficiency have to be related to space heating. Here's space cooling in Canada. It's just 2% of all energy use. And again, this pie chart will look very different in Australia. The next largest slice is water heating. It comes at 18%. And then major appliances come in 10%. And then minor appliances come in 5%. And I'd like you to think for a moment about what's missing on this pie chart. As you think about that, you'll realize that what's missing on this pie chart is lighting. Lighting makes up 5% of all energy use. It's about the same in Australia in residential homes. And what's intriguing about pointing this out is the vast majority of programs in Australia and Canada that focused on reducing residential energy use have focused on lighting. But if you look at this pie chart, you can see that lighting is just a small fraction of overall energy use. There are other slices in this pie chart that are far more important for us to focus on. So these pie charts help us to identify what are the areas that are most important for us to focus on, and then begin to ask ourselves what behaviors might be related to any one of these particularly important sections of the pie chart. So let me pull out water heating, an area that's often underemphasized, and show you how we can list specific behaviors over this. So here are some of the actions we might ask Australians to engage in to reduce residential hot water use or heating of hot water. We could get them to install low-floor shower heads, or sometimes we're called high-efficiency shower heads. We could get them to turn down the temperature on the hot water heater thermostat if it's set too high. We could get them to install an insulating blanket around the hot water heater if it's radiating heat. And you can literally tell if your heater or boiler is radiating heating by just putting your hand on it. If it is, it's not well insulated. You can install an on-demand system. So rather than having the water be stored in the tank and wasting energy through that, we can be heating the water just as it's needed. And of course, finally, we can be asking people to take shorter showers. Now, what I've just done here is I've taken one of the most important slices, in this case the second most important slice in Canada, and I've asked what are the behaviors that are associated with it. We don't know yet which of these behaviors are most important, but we know we're in the second most important slice, and these are behaviors potentially that are worthwhile to pursue. Now, when we think about writing down those behaviors, I want to encourage you that there are two things that you should focus on. Any behavior that you list has to be both non-divisible and end state. And let me mention what I mean by both of those things. Non-divisible means that we do not want to be listing categories of behaviors. So you don't want to be saying, encourage people to engage in behaviors that reduce outdoor water usage. Encourage people to engage in installing energy-efficient appliances in their home. The reason why we can't be talking about categories and have to be talking about instead non-divisible behaviors is that each of those behaviors, as I suggested before, have their own set of barriers and motivations associated with them. If you're up at the level of category, we're not going to be at a level of specificity that helps us to really clearly understand why a behavior is not being engaged in and what we can do in terms of delivering programs to facilitate people adopting that behavior. So first thing, behaviors have to be non-divisible. Secondly, the behaviors have to be end state. And what's meant by end state is we're trying to promote the behavior that actually brings about the actual reduction in energy use, reduction in water usage, etc. So the program in Queensland, for example, that I acted as an advisor on, they wanted to initially give every household in Queensland who was participating in this household energy efficiency project 10 complex fluorescent light bulbs. And I said to them, that's a great idea, but that's not the end state behavior. What we really want is we want people to install those high efficiency light bulbs. How about just changing the program slightly so that you say to them, we would love to give you 10 complex fluorescent light bulbs, but first of all, we need to ask you to remove 10 incandescents and give those to us. And once you've done that, we'll then give you the 10 CFLs. And this is a lot like programs operating in Western Australia, where people can take their inefficient shower head back to Bunnings and get it replaced for an efficient one. By doing that, by removing the undesirable behavior, we're focusing on the end state action. So every behavior that we want to list here needs to be non-divisible and end state, and nothing should be a strategy at this point. An audit, for example, is not a behavior. It's a strategy to bring about some behavior that we wish to encourage. At this point, we don't yet know what the barriers and benefits are to the behaviors that we're going to select. It's not wise for us at this point to be thinking about what our strategy should look like. We're just trying to identify at this point what are the most important behaviors to focus on. Now, how do we compare these behaviors? 3 things you want to think about combining. First of all, we want to look at the relative impact. How impactful is installing a high-efficiency shower head, reducing energy use, compared to putting in a programmable thermostat, compared to getting people to lower the blinds at the beginning of the day so they're not getting passive heating in their homes? We want to look at each of those different actions. Now, impact, interestingly, is often where people stop this process. They just looked at the different behaviors in terms of the potential impact. And when we do that, we're failing to include 2 other important factors. We also want to look at probability. What's the actual likelihood of people engaging in specific behavior? In Canada, for example, when we delivered our national campaign to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, they selected 2 very high-impact behaviors, getting Canadians to put more insulation in their attics and getting them to put in place energy-efficient furnaces as replacements for energy-inefficient furnaces. While those were 2 really high-impact behaviors, what they didn't look at or bring into bear upon the selecting the behaviors is what's the actual likelihood of getting people to do those 2 actions. You may have a high-impact behavior, but if very few people are likely to do it, it's not a very worthwhile behavior to pursue at this point. So we want to look at both impact and probability, and thirdly, we want to look at what's called penetration. Penetration simply refers to the number of people who have already adopted the behavior. If lots of people are already participating in action, like curbside recycling, we may not have much more to gain by trying to foster that particular behavioral change, and there may be other actions related to waste reduction that we may wish to pursue. Now let me show you how you can combine these things together. Some of this data is coming from Queensland, and you can see this is a project I worked on in Queensland where we were trying to work out which behaviors were most important to pursue. I'm showing you just 5 of 61 behaviors that we considered. The first column, the one that says GHG, that's impact. That's calculated by the Institute for Sustainable Futures in Sydney. And they said, what's the kilograms per household per year reduction to be associated in Queensland with people purchasing green power? And because most of the electricity in Queensland comes from burning coal, getting people to switch over to purchasing green power has, as you can see on the screen, a very large reduction in CO2 associated with it. Cold water washing brings about a 450 kilogram per household per year reduction. increasing use of clotheslines, 200, installing 10 CFLs, 700, installing a low-flow shower head, 215. So that's the impact column. The column right beside that is probability. We did a statewide survey, and we asked people on a scale of 0 through 4, how likely would you be to do these different actions? And you can see the statewide averages there. So we've got impacts in the first column, and then probability. And we didn't actually measure penetration, but I've provided you with some potential estimates of penetration. And what you might want to jot down here is that when we're looking at penetration, we want to take the inverse of that number. So 3% of households in Queensland have purchased green power. That means that 97% of households are still a potential addressable audience. So we would take the inverse of 3, that would then be 0.97. And then what we do literally is we multiply those three numbers together, 8,700 times 2.15 times 0.97, and it gives you 18,143 as weight. And what we're working out is what are the weights for each of these potential behaviors that we might go after. And this allows us then to take a long list of behaviors and cull it down to a much shorter list of behaviors that are worthwhile for us to pursue. So John, that's the end of the section on selecting behaviors. So let me pause here and ask for any questions that people might have.
Thanks, Doug. That's been really interesting. So can you just pop back and just refresh our memories, please, about the non-divisible behaviors? Can you just explain again how to choose those non-divisible behaviors, please?
Okay, so let me just go back a couple slides to that. So if you go back to this slide, this is the list, John, of the hot water heater-related behaviors. And what we're doing here is we're listing the different potential actions we might go after, and we're mapping these over one of the slices in our pie chart that we've deemed to be important enough to pursue. Right? Now, that list of behaviors, we need to make sure that everything on that list that we've put down is non-divisible and is end state. So the reason why those things are important is, again, non-divisible behaviors, I'll rephrase this, if we're focusing on a category, which is actions in a home that might be related to people purchasing energy-efficient appliances, each of those different actions can have different barriers associated with them. And because the barrier is different, the strategies that we have to deliver to get people to purchase those different types of energy-efficient appliances need to differ as well. And a really good example from Australia that many of you will resonate with is that when people purchase energy-efficient fridges in Australia, interestingly, often their energy use goes up rather than down. And the reason for that is they often go and take their old fridge, put it outside in the shed. And if you think about running a fridge inside a shed that might be 40, 50 degrees temperature during the daytime, energy use is, well, going to increase because you're keeping that old fridge, but it's going to go up even more because you're running it in a really inefficient situation. So you need to look at behaviors like the purchase of energy-efficient fridges and try to understand what are the barriers and motivations between people moving over to more energy-efficient fridge. What are the barriers and motivations to expect them keeping the old one? Make sure that we're delivering programs that get rid of the old fridge. So the reason, again, why we need to be making sure we're not at the level of categories is the barriers tend to differ for each of these different actions. And then, again, each of the behaviors we want to focus on should be end state. So to give you a few examples of this, we don't want people to purchase programmable thermostats. We want them to install and actually program them. We don't want people to purchase shower heads. We want people to actually install them. We want to be focusing on the behavior that actually brings about the result in some environmental improvement. Does that answer your question, John?
Yes, it does. Thanks, Doug. Sorry, I just muted myself there because we have a large thunderstorm coming through, and I noticed, I was just looking at the weather map, there's large thunderstorms for southeast Queensland and right down into New South Wales. So there's a bit of noise in the background here, so I apologise if that's coming through. But you did answer the question, thanks, Doug. And a number of people are saying thank you for using Queensland examples. We really appreciate that you've taken the time to customise your presentation today.
No worries, happy to.
Good. Now, just looking at the slide that you're at there now, so there's two things. One person's confused about the 3% and needing to use the inverse. And
sure.
Can you also talk about the probability, the 1 to 4 scale, and which end is which?
Okay, sure.
Please.
And again, apologies to everyone on the line. This is a very condensed version of my 2-day workshop, so there's some things that I'm glossing over, but let me pause and explain each of those items a little more. So let's start with penetration first. 3% is, let's presume that that's the actual adoption rate of green power in Queensland. What that means is that 97% of households have not adopted it. So whenever you find out what the present level of adoption is, we're taking the inverse of this. For those of you on the line who might be working on waste reduction, if you knew that 80% of the households in Melbourne or in Perth or Adelaide were already participating in curbside recycling, that would mean that you had 20% of households that you could deliver a program to. So we're always taking the inverse of the penetration numbers because that's our addressable audience, essentially. So you always take that number subtracted from 1 to find out what the inverse is, okay? And that's what we're going to use to multiply with. Now, coming back to the second question about probability. When you ask people how likely they are, there's 2 things I want to point out here. When you ask people how likely they are to do something, we know that they will fudge their answers, and they will fudge them in the direction of saying that they're more likely to engage in behavior than they actually are. So what I want to point out to you, first of all, is that when you're doing this, don't pay attention to the absolute numbers. Instead, pay attention to the range and distribution across the numbers. What's being rated higher in terms of probability, what's being rated moderate, what's being rated low. That's very useful to look at that range. The absolute numbers are not all that useful. The second thing I want to suggest here is that the scale that you use always has to start with 0. We're asking people how likely they are to do these different behaviors that we're interested in, where 0 means not at all likely, and 4 in this case means very likely, and this is the actual scale that we use in Queensland. Now, the reason why the scale has to start with 0 is this. If you look at purchasing green power, you'll see that that has 8,700 kilograms per household per year associated with it. Now, let's imagine that no one in Queensland was actually interested in purchasing green power, and we used a scale that went from 1 to 4. We would be multiplying 8,700 by 1, which is still going to give you that huge number, 8,700. So you always have to use a scale that starts with 0 as the beginning point, so that people who have very little interest in engaging behavior, you're going to be multiplying by a number that's meaningful. Other questions, John?
Yes, regarding that same table. So it would seem as though low penetration seems to be a positive in the index in the way you've done it, but wouldn't that indicate there might be really tough barriers to overcome and therefore limited opportunity to influence change?
Yeah, that's a great question. It could be that there would be limited possibilities, but we're going to find that out by asking about probability. And again, I've glossed over this. There's 2 ways for us to get information about probability. The rigorous way is to look at programs that other people have delivered to bring about the same behavioral change. So Sydney Water, for example, has delivered a program to get people to replace their low-efficiency shower heads with high-efficiency shower heads, where people had to go to the local post office and take the old one there and get a replacement. In a pilot program that they delivered, they got about 50% of households, which is pretty remarkable to do that. Program in Sudbury, which is north of Toronto, they got about 67% of households to have their high-efficiency shower heads replaced. Now, in that particular case, they actually went into people's homes and said, we would like to install this for free. And not surprising, those numbers were larger. So when we look at the probability numbers, we've got 2 ways in which we can get probability information. By far the most rigorous way is to look at existing case studies in which the context is very similar. In Sydney's case, when they were delivering that program, their reservoirs were at 12.6% of capacity. You could imagine that people would be highly motivated to make sure that they did not have to truck potable water into Sydney at that time, and people would have the motivation to go down to local post office. So you have to look at the context within which the program is delivered, but if the context is similar, we can often look at existing case studies and use that as a gauge of how well this type of program might work in our particular context. So to answer the question, yes, in general, the penetration rates may be related to the fact that the behavior is just difficult to bring about, and that will be reflected in probabilities. But very frequently, it's because we haven't delivered the program effectively yet. And we have to think our way through ways in which we can effectively tackle the barriers and benefits, and by doing that, alter the likelihood that people engage in the action.
Okay, thanks, Doug. We have some mathematicians in the audience, and they can follow the logic, but when you multiply by 0, the answer is 0. So how does that work out?
That's how exactly it should work out. Is that if you had no likelihood that people would engage in the behavior, so probability 0, you'd be multiplying 8,700 by 0, which would give you 0, right? And that's what you'd have as the weight at the end of it, because one of the things you're multiplying by is 0. So what we're looking for is, it's obviously very unlikely that's going to happen, but you may have numbers that track towards that end of the scale, and that's what you'd want to see. You'd want to know, here's a behavior that's very low probability that people would engage in it, and even though it might have really large impact that's associated with it, if there's a very low probability of people engaging in the behavior, then that's important for us to know up front. Now, what people might want to jot down here is that clearly the way in which we design and deliver our programs will have an impact upon those probabilities. So when we did this in Queensland, we literally said, how likely would you be to install a low-flow shower head if you had to go to local Bunnings hardware and purchase the shower head and do the installation yourself? How likely would you be to put in a high-efficiency shower head if we gave you one for free, but you had to do the installation yourself? And then finally, how likely would you be to do this if we not only gave it to you, but we did the installation? So usually in these cases, we're providing some context to the way in which we might deliver the program, and that will bump these probabilities around. The one you're looking there at, number 5, the question we asked in that particular case is, how likely would you be to do the installation if we gave you the shower head for free?
Okay. Now, there's lots of comments coming through, but I am conscious of time, so I'll just finish with this last one that, again, relates to the slide you're on. The final column has the heading of weight. Can you talk us through some synonyms for the word weight? Like, is that potential outcome or impact?
Importance. Yeah, I wouldn't use the word impact, John, because we're using impact in this particular case to be greenhouse gas emissions. Think of that as being the impact column. The one right beside that obviously is probability. The one beside that is penetration. Think of it as weight as being overall importance. It's combining those 3 things together to give us a good guesstimate of the relative importance of these behaviors. Now, again, the reason why I think this is important is all of you have a long list of potential behaviors that you could be encouraging people to engage in. And we want to find some way to be able to take that long list and cull it down, as I said before, to a shorter list. And as many of you know, what often happens is someone comes into your workplace and says, we ought to do X. And they are showering that morning, and you're thinking, oh, this would be a great program to deliver, and they come in and convince the colleagues that that should be behavioral that we go after. We need to be more rigorous than that. We need to be able to look across different behaviors and come up with some way of rank ordering their importance. And in my book and in my workshops, I talk about actually tiering these actions into tier 1. That list of behaviors has the best combination of impact, probability, and penetration. Those should be the behaviors we go after first. Tier 2 should be that set of actions that are not as important as tier 1 are still worthwhile to go after. And tier 3, think of those as being the behaviors that are proverbially on the back burner. If we've done a really good job of going after tier 1 and tier 2, then tier 3 would be the behaviors we'd go after next. Now, last thing about this, some of you might be thinking about on the line, what about if we have more than one impact? Very commonly the case in which people may be delivering a program, for example, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They might be also interested in trying to reduce air pollutants. And so what you do in this particular case is you'd have 2 columns for impact. And the group of advisors or subcommittee that's overviewing the program that you're delivering, you would need to step back, first of all, and say to yourself, how are we going to weight those different impacts? So you might give 60% of the weight, for example, to reducing CO2 emissions and 40% to reducing NOx and VOx emissions in Melbourne. And then based upon that, we'd have different weights associated with these actions we might encourage people to engage in. And then we'd be just adding one additional column into this. And we'd be putting, in the case of greenhouse gas emissions, 0.60 in front of 8,700. And then whatever the column was for NOx and VOx emissions, we'd be putting 0.40 in front of that. It just makes the equation a little longer, but allows us to be able to look at more than one impact at the same time.
Right. So, Doug,
do you want to move on to this point, John?
Yes, let's move on, because of course the reason we came up with this table was to help us select the behaviours to target in the first place. So that's the first of 5 steps, so I'm thinking perhaps we do need to move on.
Yeah, I will be covering the other steps in a little less detail, don't worry. Okay. So let's move on to the next step. Okay, the second step, as you know, is you've taken this long list of behaviors and we've culled it down to a shorter list. The second step is to do barrier and benefit research. I'm going to cover this very briefly. In my workshops, we literally spend almost a whole day talking about just this one topic. There are broadly 4 things that you can do to uncover the barriers and benefits to the behaviors you select in the first step. The first is to do literature search. And you always want to start with literature search. We want to find out what have other people done in this area. It might be that you're working in an area in which enough other research has been done that you don't have to do anything else. So literature search first, and then observations. Now, you can only do observations if the behavior you're interested in is observable in a way that's unobtrusive. So we can observe, for example, people having torn up their front lawns and replaced them with xeriscaping, native plants, for example. We can observe the number of people walking and biking, telecommuting, carpooling. There's a number of behaviors that are out there and observable. So observations are very helpful as well. When we're doing observations, as when we do focus groups and surveys, we always have 2 groups. People who are engaged in the behavior that we're interested in and those that are not. And what we're looking for is what distinguishes or differs between those 2 groups. And that is often very helpful information in helping us to work out what our program is going to look like. So literature search first, then observations, then focus groups. When you're running focus groups, again, we've got 2 groups. People who have already adopted the behavioral change, those that have not. I want to encourage you to write down that you never, ever want to have people who are active and inactive in the same focus group. And the reason for that is that people who have already adopted the behavior, they have a strong tendency to make the people who have not yet adopted the behavior feel uncomfortable about the fact that they're not yet carpooling, for example. You want the people who have not yet adopted the behavior to feel comfortable talking about why they've not done that. Because if we're going to develop effective programs, we need to intimately know what their barriers are and what might motivate them. And they're much more likely to provide us with that information if they're participating in a focus group with other people who are not yet engaged. Final thing we want to consider doing is surveys. You always leave the surveys to last. And again, we're surveying people who have adopted the behavior, those that have not. What we're looking for is differences between those groups. So literature search first, observations if you can do them, focus groups, and then surveys. Now what we're looking for is what social scientists call triangulation. What triangulation simply means is we're pairing up the weaknesses of one approach with the strengths of another. So focus groups, for example, give us rich, detailed information, but they have very low participation rates and therefore low generalizability. So people often want to pair a focus group or focus groups with a survey that may not provide us with this rich, detailed information, but nonetheless has better generalizability. So the overarching guidance or principle when you're thinking about doing barrier and benefit research is triangulation. No one of these methods is foolproof, and what we're trying to do is pair them together so that we can have a better sense that we have a really good handle on what the barriers and benefits are. Now, there will be some of you on the line that simply do not have the budget or the time to do focus groups and surveys. All of you ought to be able to do literature search and observations because you can do those things quickly and inexpensively. But if you don't have the budget to do focus groups and surveys, you can replace those with what are called intercept surveys. And what an intercept survey literally means is you go to a place where your target audience congregates. So some of you, example, may be working on invasive species issues. And you can go to places like a boat launch, and you can look to see who's washing off their boat equipment as they take it off the lawn, take it up from a stream or from a lake, and who's washing that equipment off and who's not. And that's your active versus inactive group. And we're literally going to ask both of those groups, what do you see as being beneficial of washing equipment off? What do you see as being challenging about doing that? So we're asking a question about barriers and a question about benefits. And we're looking at people's responses. And often those intercept surveys can give us very useful information about why people may or may not be engaged in behavior, what would motivate them to change their behavior. So crucial second step, again, I've glossed over this very quickly, but let me pause here, John, and ask if people have any questions about doing bearing benefit research that I can answer quickly.
There are no questions relating to this section, thanks, Doug. I've got a number of other general questions that might come up that we might cover at the end, depending how time goes.
Okay. Sure, okay. So third step. Third step is develop strategies. And as you can imagine, in this third step, what we're trying to do is to address the barriers and benefits that have been found for the behavior we wish to encourage. And what you can see on the screen is we want to do two things. We want to drive down the barriers to the behavior we'd like people to adopt, and we'd like to enhance the benefits that go along with that action. Now, most environmental programs in Australia focus on just that top line. But what we want to do, interestingly, at the same time, is we want to drive up the barriers to the behavior that we wish to discourage, and we want to drive down the benefits that are associated with that particular action. Lots of transportation-related programs, for example, to try to do this. Imagine efforts like traffic calming, HOV lanes in which people are driving the high occupancy lane. It's more convenient for them to get to work, and actually putting the HOV lane in place means that everyone else who's single occupant driving is going to take longer to get into work. We want to be focusing on both the behavior we wish to encourage as well as the behavior we wish to discourage at the same time, and we want to understand something about the barriers and benefits. And again, as you can see on the screen, we're trying to reduce the barriers, enhance the benefits, the behavior we wish to encourage. We're trying to do exactly the opposite of that for the behavior that we wish to discourage. Now, fourth step is to pilot test our strategies. Most of the programs that I've seen evaluated in Australia look like this, as they do in Canada. People have a strategy they want to test, and they get some pre-test, or what are more commonly called in Australia baseline measurements. And then they deliver a program to that group, and then they get some post-test measurements, and then they follow up at a later time to see whether or not they sustain the behavioral change. So let's imagine this was a program to get people to use mass transit. Now, if you have just one group like this, interestingly, we can't actually know whether it was our program that caused the change in behavior. And the reason for that is, let's imagine that we delivered a program in Melbourne at exactly the time in which gasoline or petrol prices spiked about 4 or 5 years ago. If you're delivering a mass transit initiative at that time, you wouldn't know whether it was an increase in petrol prices, the program that you delivered, or a combination of the two things that was actually causing the change in behavior. Now, you could know that, however, if we also had a control group. And this is a much stronger design. We just have two groups rather than one. Here we're getting some pre-test measurements. We're delivering no program. Then we have some post-test measurements that happen at the same time that they happen with the strategy group. And then we get some follow-up measurements. What we're looking for here is that no changes should happen with the control group. If there's nothing going on in the community, larger community, then nothing should be happening with the control group. But if we do see changes in the control group, whatever we see there has to be subtracted off of what we see with the strategy group. And the differences between those two is what we can fairly attribute to our program. So let me show you two projects that I've been engaged with that I think people find interested have used this whole process. This first project, as you can see on the screen, is called Turn It Off. And this program was delivered in Canada. As you can imagine, it's a program to get people to turn off the vehicle engines when they're parked in their car and they're not going anywhere. So they're waiting for a child to come out of school, for example. We started off by, first of all, working out how common is this action in Canada. It turns out at any given time, even in the warmer months, about 56% of Canadians are idling their engines in different localities, locations across the country. We then went and did bearing benefit research around the behavior. We found some very clear barriers and some very clear benefits. Most important barrier, people simply forget to turn their engine off. Secondly, they believe the length of time that they should idle their car for before it's more efficient to turn their car off and then restart it is longer than 3 minutes. The actual threshold is 0, but that's not what people believe. And what's important about that is that a barrier doesn't have to be real for you to have to address it. Even if it's a perceived barrier, you have to still think being addressing it. And thirdly, they thought that turning their car engines on and off repeatedly would hurt their starter. Now, that was true 30 years ago, but it's not true today. So we have 3 very clear barriers. What's interesting on the benefit side is this is a program designed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. But when we ask people what would motivate them to turn their engines off, CO2 is virtually never mentioned. principal reason why people would be turning their engines off was to enhance air quality. And once we knew that, we delivered our whole program through that lens. And what some of you might want to write down is that literally benefits trump barriers. If people are not motivated to act, the barriers don't really come into play. We have to find ways to motivate people first, and then once they're motivated, try to strip away the barriers to them engaging in action. So the strategy I'm about to introduce you to, we pilot tested both schools and what are called TTC, Toronto Transit Commission, kiss and ride sites. And we pilot tested two different types of strategies. In the first strategy, you'll see on the screen on your left-hand side, we put just signs up. The sign that you're looking at was about half a meter high and about a third of a meter wide. And we had 4 different versions of these signs, and we put these signs up throughout these different parking lots, encouraging people at both schools and at Toronto Transit Commission kiss and ride sites to turn their engines off. The signs by themselves did not work. If they had worked, it would have been our most cost-effective thing to do. But when we're pilot testing community-based social marketing programs, we usually want to test different strategies against each other to find which are most effective. In the second strategy we pilot tested, we, in contrast, hired university students who went into these 2 different types of parking lots and they spoke to people. Right? And we're running these at the same time in different types of parking lots. So let's imagine that John has a daughter and I'm working with Toronto Public Health. I walk up to his car when he's waiting to pick his daughter up from school, and I'm wearing a T-shirt that says Toronto Public Health. And I'm literally pointing at my T-shirt as I speak to him and say, as you can see, I'm working with Toronto Public Health. And the reason why I'm doing that is I want to make sure that he associates what I'm about to say with an agency that's well-known and well-respected in Toronto. So I say to him, as you can see, I'm working with Toronto Public Health. We're delivering a program to enhance air quality for children at the school. Now notice what I'm doing. I'm starting off by speaking about a benefit, and we're doing that in order to enhance motivation, increase the likelihood that John will listen to me, and I can then focus in on the barriers that might be precluding him from turning his engine off. So I say, we're delivering a program to enhance air quality for children at the school, and you may not know it, I didn't know this until recently myself, but most Canadians believe that they should idle their car for longer than 3 minutes before it's more fuel efficient to turn it off and restart it. The actual threshold, we found out recently, is just 0. You should turn it off immediately. And further, turning your car on and off repeatedly will not hurt your starter. That used to be true 30 years ago, but with a recent car like you have, it's a non-issue. So very brief conversation, and I turn to him and say, would you be willing to turn your car off in the future? Let's imagine John says to me, sure, I'd be happy to do that. The commitment that he's just made to me is the weakest type of commitment you can seek. It's a straight verbal commitment that's private. So I say to John, that's great that you're willing to turn your car engine off, but we know the primary reason why people don't do this is they simply forget. So I have a small static link sticker with me that I'd like to ask you to put in the front windshield of your car. Now, why static link? Because people told us very clearly they would not put the sticker in their car windshield if it was going to leave adhesive on the window. So I asked them, would you be willing to put this on your front window? 32% of the 82% who said that they would turn their car engines off put the sticker on their front windshield. And each of these conversations took about a minute per car. Here are the measurements. We measure 2 things. Are people reducing the amount of idling that they're engaged in, and are we reducing the length of time that they're idling for? We reduced the number of cars idling by 32%, and we reduced the length of time that they're idling for by 73%. We almost wiped out the behavior based upon these very brief conversations that were very specifically targeting the most important benefit and the most important barriers. This led, interestingly, to a turnkey toolkit being set up in Canada that was run by Natural Resources Canada. They created a website where municipalities across the country could download all the materials that we had been able to demonstrate through this pilot is working effectively. We now have some 200 Canadian communities that are delivering anti-idling programs. They're based upon what we initially pilot tested in Toronto, and some 50 of those have gone on to declare themselves idle-free. Let me pause here, John, and ask if there's any questions about this particular pilot.
Questions about this particular pilot? No, there are lots of other little questions coming through, but okay, not about this particular pilot.
Okay, let me just give one more, and then we'll pause, and I'll handle those other questions, okay? So the second one I want to introduce you to is a program called Turn Us Off. It's a very interesting program. This was headed up by Jennifer Tapanenko. This is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which is an organization that brings together people working on sustainability issues for large cities across the United States and Canada. Pilot tested this strategy to get people to turn their computer equipment off in 3 different cities in the U.S. They first of all identified the barriers to people not turning their engines off, and they came up with a 2-pronged strategy. First was to email out to employees and let them know why it was important for them to be turning their engines off. When they tested, to see whether or not the emails by themselves had any impact upon people turning off their equipment, and the answer was it didn't. It made people more knowledgeable, but as I mentioned before, simply being more knowledgeable is not necessarily likely going to lead people to change their behavior. So the first component was this email going out. Shortly after that, they asked people to make a commitment, and this commitment was part of a prompt. And you'll see this commitment and prompt on your screen now. People would literally just fill this in, and this is just a very small prompt that's perhaps maybe 7-8 centimeters wide, and it gets stuck by a static link on the bottom left-hand corner of your monitor. And they then looked at what impact is having this prompt with your name on it saying you're committing to turn off your computer and monitor at the end of the workday have upon people actually engaging in this behavior. Here's the results of this. They looked beforehand at how many people would turn their CPU off, and 58% were. After they implemented the program with the email, the commitment, and the prompt, that number rose to 72%. When they looked at monitors, initially only 21% were turning off their monitors, and that number rose up to 53%. Again, following through the process of CBSM, identifying the barriers to this particular action, and then coming up with strategies that are very clearly tailored to that. So any questions about any of that?
Yes. So I'm conscious of time, so let me just go back to some questions that were asked early on, and it's regarding the naming of the community-based social marketing. So the first question is about marketing. So
right.
For one of the listeners today, for them it implies selling a product for a price in a competitive environment. So can you just help us understand why CBSM is used as a term?
Sure, a great question. And the answer is a little bit detailed, John, but I'll try to keep it brief. Community social marketing, as I alluded to earlier, merges together knowledge coming from the traditional field of social marketing with knowledge coming from the social sciences. Social marketing has grown out of marketing, and most people who have social marketing degrees have actually gone to school in marketing programs, and they specialize in social marketing. And the language and terminology that they use is the terminology often of marketing. We know a lot in the field of social marketing about bringing about health-related behavioral changes, workplace safety, traffic safety. Many of these skin cancer prevention programs, traffic safety initiatives, workplace safety programs in Australia and New Zealand are based upon social marketing. And there's a language and methodology that comes with that. On the social science side instead, which is my background, people do not use that language. They talk about barriers and benefits, and they talk about the tools and strategies that we might build into programs. The reason why I've called it community-based social marketing is literally I was trying to borrow the best ideas from both disciplines. There's baggage that comes with social marketing from the field of marketing, and that's what I wanted at the same time give credit to where some of these ideas are coming from.
Okay, good, thank you. Now, just some specific questions about the program that you were talking about at the end there. So the program for turning cars off, was there major uptake in regional areas, or was it mainly in the urban environment where it worked?
Yeah, we don't know. It's a great question. We do not know the answer regionally. What I can say is we initially pilot tested it in Toronto, schools as well as TTC Kids and Ride sites. Kids and Ride site, by the way, that name comes from a place in which a partner drops someone off in the morning, they kiss them goodbye, hence the name, and then they take a train from one of the cities that surrounds Toronto down to the downtown core. Not a lot of idling first thing in the morning, but a lot of idling later in the day in which the person's waiting in the parking lot for the car to come back. So we pilot tested initially in Toronto. We then did 2 other cities. I did a more regional city, 150,000 people, very similar results. We did the whole city, all 49 schools, the whole municipal fleet, and most of the major parking lots in the city. A colleague of mine did Mississauga, which is just south of Toronto. They did not do all the schools because it's a large city of nearly 1 million people, but they did many of the schools, all the municipal fleet, and many of the major parking lots, very similar results. And we've seen that same pattern across different communities in Canada, but most of the delivery has been in urban areas, and most of this is happening, John, because of people's concerns around air quality issues. So that's tended to concentrate in some of the more urban centers in Canada, like Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, etc.
Right. Doug, I'm wondering if you can tell us one more time about the workshops that are coming our way. A lot of people have been asking very detailed questions, and I've been suggesting to some of them on using the chat box saying, you should attend one of Doug's workshops because
Sure.
I know that you allow time to discuss a lot of these things in more time than we've got today. So can you tell us about the workshops, please?
Sure. So as you can see on the screen, they're February and March 2014. They're all over the place. We've got Adelaide, Brisbane, Canberra, Hobart, Melbourne, Perth, and Sydney. And in Adelaide, in all of those locations, as well as Auckland and New Zealand, we have introductory workshops being delivered. In Auckland and in Brisbane and Melbourne and Perth, we also have advanced workshops being delivered. Each of these sessions are 2 days in length because it takes me literally that long to be able to cover this material in the detail that I feel it needs to be covered and allow people the opportunities to really be fully engaged. We really have set these sessions up to allow people the comfort that when they leave the workshop, they really feel like they can apply community-based marketing to their own programs. You can see on your screen the website for these workshops, and you can see directly below that there's a coupon code. And you want to write that coupon code down if you're interested in the workshops. That coupon code will work for the next 3 weeks, and it'll give you a $50 reduction in registering for any of the workshops that are being delivered either in Auckland or in Australia.
Great. Doug, thank you so much for essentially condensing what you do cover in those 2-day workshops into a mere 90 minutes for us today. So thank you for sharing the information that you have and your obvious passion for this area. And thanks for staying up late at night as well so that we could engage with you.
Very happy to, John, and thank you for people taking time out of part of your morning for many of you to be able to participate.
Great. Thanks, Doug. So, folks, thanks for joining us today. I'll close the webinar off now as time has come to an end. I will send out an email shortly that has links to the recording and also the presentation slides, and I'll include the links to where you can get extra information about Doug's workshops as well. So thanks for joining us today. I look forward to engaging with you again shortly. All the very best. Until we meet again, bye-bye.